Here right now is Solly Malatsi, who is from the Democratic Alliance. Solly, a very good morning to you. What do you think the story of these elections are for the Democratic Alliance?
Is that, we were able to reverse the trend of going downwards. I think for us, the deciding factor about this election was do not go down. And that's the first positive story. And also that we are showing signs of growth amongst Indian voters. We are seeing signs of growth amongst black voters across the board. And one of the things that will interest a lot of people is the realization that we've been able to maintain, our Muslim vote, particularly when you look at the number of VDs that are emerging from the Cape Flats, across the board from Hanover Park, Athlone areas, Bishop Levis. We're winning VDs there with an absolute majority.
Yeah, and going into the election, there was actually some pundits saying that the Democratic Alliance, because of its stance on the war in Gaza, could be hit hard from the Muslim vote, deciding that, listen, we don't want to vote for the Democratic Alliance considering where it stands. But you say that actually the impact of that has been minimal.
It's been very minimal. Even when we're doing our own tracking in the lead up to the election, we're not noticing a shift that was worrying us. And I think at the end of the day, particularly for residents in those areas, even though this wasn't a local government election,
there's always a check.
Their choices were.
But tell me about what the Democratic Alliance is saying here about what their story is out of these elections. And also they believe that they've been able to reverse the downward trend.
Yeah, so we've been noticing since about yesterday. So second biggest story of this election is the growth of the Patriotic Alliance. And we've been tracking this idea that the Patriotic Alliance getting rural colored votes, the Winelands region of the Western Cape. And the question really was, is the rise of the Patriotic Alliance, which is now, since the old numbers, the third largest organization in the province, would that impact the ability of the DA to get a majority, right? This idea that where the DA governs, right, they can only use that tagline if you are actually governing. The other headache I can imagine for the DA is, because a lot of the rhetoric is, when we have to deal with smaller parties, it becomes quite tough to govern, right? You have too many kingmakers, especially within the city of Cape Town. You wouldn't want that scenario happening in the Western Cape. So I think the story for the DA is maintaining their dominance within the Western Cape, seeing how they combat the Patriotic Alliance going forward, because they're not going anywhere. And we'll see as the results come in. It'll be interesting to see the colored Muslim vote in particular, right? Not just the kind of colored Cape Flats vote, but the colored Muslim vote in particular in dominant areas, whether the Israel-Palestine has impacted or not on the electoral outcomes for the party.
Some of the VDs that I really want to look at, and also coming out of Tshwane specifically, is that how much of the Democratic Alliance, through its coalition and the failures that have happened in the city of Tshwane, would contribute to what Voter was speaking about earlier on, Voter Vessels from the Freedom Front Plus, is that they've actually gained more votes out of the city of Tshwane.
So from our perspective, my analysis in particular, and Votex spoke to this. Last election, FF Plus gained voters from the DA.
Yeah.
Right. So you look at areas such as, I use Joburg as Linden in Johannesburg as a really good proxy for this type of dynamic. Voter is now saying that the DA has reclaimed those votes. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the DA has expanded. It just means it's gone back to 2014 in particular, which is a sign about, is the DA expanding its base, right? Is it hitting new demographics, or is it just returned to where it was 10 years ago when it was at 22%? And I think that's not an existential question for the party, but it's a serious question about where does your growth come from going forward?
Yeah. Solly?
I mean, I take that point, but I think, it's important, yes, to use previous elections as a baseline, but I think for us was also key that emerging out of 2019, that was the first time we experienced an electoral setback. and it would have been disastrous for the DA to experience another electoral setback in this election, because once you experience successive periods of decline, then it spells, something very dangerous for the future. So the key thing into this election, which is one part that you spoke about, was, retain governance in the Western Cape. The size of the victory then becomes something that you are very appreciative of, whether it's by 5%, 4%, and all of that. But the key thing was, once we are able to at least be at the level that we were in 2014, that signals a potential for more growth going forward. Because had it not been that case, I think many would be, with bold letters now writing the obituary of the DA. And I think it speaks about the resilience of the organization, but more importantly is what we are picking up in terms of areas of growth, particularly. The Free State will be one interesting province to look at, because we were able to pick very early into our campaign that there's going to be growth amongst black voters in Free State, which is a very wonderful thing to see, particularly given that we don't have an outlet of governance there. And I take your point about, if you are now back at the levels or closer to the levels of 2014, what does it say about, your overall growth? But the landscape has also changed significantly since 2014. I mean, we are seeing a growth with the addition of Action SA, with the addition of Bosa, with the addition of Rise Mzansi into the space, who many of those were punted, as organization that would eat into some of the support base that the DA potentially, is the base or would win from. So I think that just speaks about the resilience, given that in that space of our market share, it has become more congested.
Yeah. Let's quickly speak about coalitions, especially at a national level, and then we'll deal with the provincial level. What are the negotiations or discussion points that the Democratic Alliance are having currently, considering looking at what the numbers are looking like? Are you speaking to the ANC?
Let me just start with that. We haven't spoken to the ANC. We haven't initiated any conversations with the ANC at this time, simply out of, our faithfulness to the process that we started with the multi-party charter. And the common question emerging out of this, since the results are taking the shape that they are, has been this question that we're asking. One of the things that will happen on Sunday is that we will have a federal executive meeting, which is the standard meeting that happens post an election. That meeting will obviously look at the results in broad terms and what they mean for the party. There'll also have to be a meeting of the multi-party charter to then have, a gathering in terms of reviewing the elections and what the elections are saying about the future of that vehicle. And it will guide that conversation. But we have not opened a door for any discussions with the ANC. So if you hear anything about conversations taking place between the ANC and the DA, it's just speculation.
Is it a possibility at all?
Well, I think I'll be guided by the conversation happening out of the federal executive meeting. At this stage, it hasn't been one of the scenarios that the DA has put on the table, because we've never considered that at this stage.
Well, before the elections, actually about 2 or 3 years ago, John Steenhuisen said that the DA is willing to work with the ANC of Cyril Ramaphosa, or with the Cyril Ramaphosa faction of the ANC. And now that we are at this particular point, is the party willing to go back to that conversation and say that, hey,
the ANC of Cyril Ramaphosa is gone. If this election is anything, it's basically an indictment on the term of the ANC of Cyril Ramaphosa. It's the first ANC president to go under 50%. But I know you also had a discussion with Helen on this particular topic, two weeks or 1 week ago. And I think there's been shifts, man. There's been massive shifts in terms of 2 years ago when, there was that possible consideration of where would you possibly find not necessarily like-minded people, but people that you could work with, you could work on. The reality is that the ANC, the future of Ramaphosa in the ANC is also fast approaching its end. So that's not a consideration now.
Okay, so earlier on we've been going on and on about this provincial, the MPC's decision around what happens in the province when a political party gets, part of the MPC that is, it gets the highest number of votes in terms of nominations. And this is what Velinkosi Nihlabisa told Naledi Moleo when we spoke to him on Ask a Politician. Just take a listen to what he had to say, and then we're going to hear the Democratic Alliance's understanding around that particular agreement.
A document was released in May last year, which said, at a provincial level, a leading political party will be the one that puts forward the name of the premier. That is on record, and it was conveyed to public. That is where we stand even now as the multi-party charter. We are not concerned that we might lose our position as an official opposition in KwaZulu-Natal. We've done our groundwork. This program started in 2012 when we had 2 municipalities governing. In 2016, we got 13 municipalities. In 2021, we got 29 municipalities. In 2019, we removed the DA as an official opposition, and the IFP became the official opposition. Our next step, after the results of 29 May, we will be leading in KwaZulu-Natal because we have done our groundwork and we have done our calculation in terms of numbers.
Okay, so basically just to quickly sum up what you were saying there is that the party that gets most of the votes as per the agreement, he says, of the MPC, multi-party charter, is the party that will then make the nomination of premier candidate. I guess here in Gauteng, for instance, the Democratic Alliance would be leading. The Democratic Alliance would then put forward the name of a premier candidate. In KZN, where the IFP, as part of the multi-party charter, is leading, the IFP would then put forward the name of a premier candidate. Voter Vessels from the Freedom Front Plus is saying that that's not true. That wasn't the agreement. What does the DA know about what the agreement actually is, especially at a provincial level?
Look, I mean, you've had 2 contradicting versions from parties that are also part of the multi-party charter. So I don't want to add to the confusion about.
No, but what's your
that.
understanding of
it? But the principal position was that, you know, the party with the highest number of votes would, upon consultation with the rest of the multi-party charter, be the one that is preferred. You know, preferred is also not definitive. It also means that there could be other factors that the multi-party charter may need to consider based on the landscape that is there. But all of this depends on whether, as the multi-party charter in the province, we are able to get to 50% plus. And I think nothing is cast in stone yet, because that also depends, again, on what the picture nationally could be. You know, so I don't think there is a definitive position in terms of it should be that the party with the highest number of votes then exclusively gets the nomination for the premier. That can still be, you know, amended based on the discussion that happens.
Okay, I'll hear your opinion on this just after this quick break. Ritsuko Chikane is also joining us in the studio. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we conclude the conversation.